Hi, I'm Dennis Orsborn, and I'm the second oldest of the Orsborn family boys, and then Noelle.
Yes, I'm the fifth child. I'm Noelle Krueger.
She was actually scheduled to be born on January something, but we were having this big Christmas party at the house, and all of a sudden our mom's sitting there in a chair saying, "We gotta go." So she was born on Christmas night.
And I'm Bruce. I'm the third child. I'm the neglected middle child of the Orsborn family.
Let's start at the beginning. So it sounds like you have some relatives that kind of have attachment with this parish before it was a parish.
Correct. So when the great-grandparents moved to La Mesa in the very early 1900s, like I think it was 1906, before there was a La Mesa, I think even, great-grandfather Thomas McCarthy, part of the whole big McCarthy clan that's here at the parish. So he used to have the priest come out and say Mass in the house with our grandmother, who was a child at that time. And the story goes, as recounted by my great-uncle, was that he would come out, they would have Mass, and then great-grandpa would get the bottle of Irish whiskey and they would disappear from the rest of the family. And so that was the early stories of the pre-parish, I think. But then the parish came along, and from what I understand, it was probably our grandmother, Sarah McCarthy, well, Orsborn, but McCarthy, and then Mrs. Jackson were like the two women any pastor would fear in a parish. Our grandmother was kind of the women's club in charge of that side, and Mrs. Jackson, who the Sables are from, she was the choir director and organist, the first one in the parish. And so that's the tabernacles in honor of the Jackson family, and they're the ones that did the church move, I think, as well. Yeah, so those are the early, some of the early stories.
Well, way back then, this church wasn't here when I was a child growing up.
It was a nice big garden.
Yeah, it was a garden out here. I used to come out here and watch the birds fly around here in this garden here, and then they tore it all out and put the church in here. But I was baptized over in the other church, First Communion. I finally was confirmed in this church, so it was built by that time. But I remember going in there many, many times. It was kind of old, dark. Our grandmother used to be the one to take us in there most of the time for Sunday Mass. But I will also never forget the fact that we didn't have a certain place where we always sat. But our father, being the fireman in the family, fire chief eventually, we always sat up in the choir loft all the time, so he could look around and watch everybody. So that was kind of our favorite spot. We could come in and get out early, leave early if we had to. Anyway, so we were always in the choir loft. But yeah, that's where it all started, was in the old church with us, with Father Dennis J. Berry. He was the pastor at the time.
I remember being here in this church. I was born in 1962, baptized.
You were baptized in the other church. I do.
So anyway, my first communion was here.
Or Father Healy did it.
Monsignor.
Now, was a Monsignor.
So my first communion was here, reconciliation, confirmation, marriage, everything was right here.
Wow. I was baptized in the other church by Father Thomas Maher. I did my first confession with Father Tom Healy, and then after I became a priest, I was his associate in a parish. So, and his response when I reminded him that I did my first confession with him, he looked at me and says, "I don't remember a thing." So, but that was the funny part. But early 1960s, that was his first assignment as a priest, was here at St. Martin's. First communion with Father Berry, like so many. But I have the one story that there was Father Meany, who was here in 1920s, I think into the 30s. It's spelled Mesny, but I think because he's Belgian, the S is silent. They always call him Father Meany. So. Little tiny guy, and he was not the best kept person. Very old clothes. So the first thing I have is our grandmother telling me the story about how the women's club decided to get him a new suit. And then they weren't happy with him, because he gave away the suit to someone who needed it and was still wearing the old one, which was ripped, I guess, and everything. And so this was during the Depression. And then they would bring him food, and he was notorious that after they would leave, he'd take it and give it to somebody else. Fast forward many years, I'm a priest. And my dad, who was then the fire chief, he had a mentor who was Ray Lyles, who was the fire chief of La Mesa for many years, who was long retired and in his 90s. And come in, and he's my dad's big mentor, and he tells my dad to go away because he wanted to talk to me. And and my dad was really shocked, like, what? And so he calls me in, and we sit down, and he says, I have to tell you something I have never told anyone, and I swore I would never tell. And he says, you know, your great-grandfather owned La Mesa Mercantile Company, which was the Catholic store in La Mesa. And my dad, being a Mason, we owned the other grocery store. And he says, you've heard of Father Meany? And I said, yes, I've heard stories. And he said, Father Meany would come into the other side store with the Masons, and he would buy a big box of food and say, deliver it to this family. And he was the box boy at the time, because this was 1920s or maybe early 30s. And he said, but Father, they're not Catholic. And he says, I know they're not Catholic. Swear you will never tell anyone. But he did that repeatedly. And for me, that's humorous, because my vocation as a priest came out of St. Martin's. And I thought, isn't that interesting, that I'm still being formed by the example of Father Meany and by someone who's not Catholic telling me what kind of priest I should be. I can remember Father Barry, when he'd get up and preach, he was loud. And he would, at First Communions, he'd always talk about the first window, Jesus and the children. And he'd say, well, you kids, we put Jesus and the children up there especially for you for your First Communion. And he'd say that every time once the First Communion started being here. Yeah.
Before they built this church, it was getting really crowded at the other one.
Yes.
And I heard stories that they had masses every hour, on the hour, and they had to get the people in and out. So the masses were really short. And
true, and they had speakers on the outside, and if you were at the bottom of the steps, you were going to Mass, even though you couldn't you couldn't see anything, yeah, because it was up and down the sides and just packed. For decades, the middle of the big window there was a piece missing right in the middle, and you could always turn around and look outside through that hole in the window during Mass.
So there's a lot of fond memories that go way back, but they're countless. But some of the first ones I can remember were coming to Mass with my grandma, because I would wait as Grandma Sally Orsborn. So we'd come to church here, and I remember I'd kind of doze off. She had really soft shoulders, so I could lean over and kind of go to sleep while we were at Mass and wake up and stand up, sit down, and kneel. So it kind of brought me out of my slumber. But I'll never forget one time we were sitting there, and I was getting a little bit bored, I guess. And so I took out a little key or something I had in my pocket, and I actually carved my initials in the pillar of the old church over there. And you could barely see it. So I went back years later and looked for it. I could still see it. And then going back over there to Father Barry Hall now, as they call it, I went looking for it, and I kind of remembered where it was, counted up the number of columns right there by the door. It's been sanded off now, so you can't find it anymore. So my legacy has been destroyed. But more important than even going to Mass is I remember going to catechism. We couldn't afford to go to St. Martin's Academy. We went to public school. So I do recall going to catechism every Monday. We'd come up here, get out of the car. It was only an hour or two long. So, but the thing about catechism I will never forget was that was my real first encounter with nuns. The convent was still here at the time. Most of the nuns were teachers at St. Martin's Academy, so they did the catechism classes after school let out. So I'll never forget, I was probably in my first grade, And the nun that was teaching the catechism class was Sister Mary Bede. I'll never forget her. She was one of the younger ones in the convent. But I was so afraid of her that I was afraid to even raise my hand to go to the bathroom. They did teach us one thing, and that was discipline and respect. So those are traits back when I was a first grader that I kind of learned. And where have we gone? You never see that stuff in school anymore. But they really taught us well there, and you really began to pay attention to what they were saying and not fear them, but respect them.
So my memories of St. Martin is, again, doing all my sacraments here, going to catechism as well, but I also sang in the folk group, and just to be involved in a wonderful parish. Everybody just family here, everybody, and we go and see them after Mass for coffee and donuts and just chit-chat, get together. So just the family warm feeling. Of course, being in Harvard, that's a huge group of people, so big family, but just being together as a family here in our parish.
So I guess I'm the one that was involved in most of the stuff here at the parish. Growing up, our mother was Lutheran until she passed away. So kind of a common occurrence would be she would get up early and go to the Lutheran church, St. Luke's, on the other side of La Mesa, and then would bring the car back, and then we with Grandma would come to Mass, and then when we got home, breakfast would be ready. So that was a tradition when we were smaller. But some of the things I was going to Mass in the other church and then the building of this one. But I also remember the CCD also. And I had a sister for second grade, but I don't remember what her name was, for First Communion. But I remember just a lot of people of faith. And a lady named Irene Powers taught, and I remember was fascinated. There was John Morgan, who was a parishioner. He taught for years. And even Jim Freed, I remember in high school years, was teaching. And so that was a big thing. And then we were in Boy Scouts here. Big tradition. And just lots and lots of families involved.
I remember one time during Boy Scouts, we always used that as our meeting place, was Father Barry Hall. So we were in there quite a bit. And I remember one time we split up in little groups, and our group was assigned to go meet up in the choir loft at the time. So we were up there kind of milling around. There was this door there, and it was always locked. And then one day I went up there, it's not locked, it's open. So we opened it up, and it was the doorway to the steeple. So you get up in there, we crawled all the way up to the very top of that thing. And it was there, it's still there today, but it's the only time I've ever been in it. So that was one of my greatest moments in life, to climb to the steeple. A lot of fond memories with Troop 51. So we spent a lot of time there. All 4 brothers in the family were Eagle Scouts. So we all went through the entire program.
When the troop was first formed, actually Father Barry was the scoutmaster for many years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was the guy running it. Yeah.